Assalamu alaikum. This is Munib from Atlanta.
Welcome to the show. What's the question for Rabbi?
Yeah, so my question was that in previous videos, Rabbi has talked about how Paul could possibly not be a Pharisee, essentially, and you gave reasons pertaining to that he is misquoting from the Tanakh, and also the fact that he could not be from Tarsus, etc. One other thing that you also mentioned in one of your videos, one of the names of God is Rahman, which is also in Muslim tradition as well. So my question was that if Paul was really a Pharisee, shouldn't he also known that this is what God is called in the Tanakh, and then hence he could not have, if he knew that, right, he would not have actually said that you only need blood for redemption, etc. Or basically that in Galatians 3:30 that Jesus became a curse. So I just wanted to get your thoughts that if he knew this is the name of the God in Tanakh, then how could he ever come up with his theology later on? Do you think that this is another reason why he could never have been a disciple of Gamaliel? Because he should have known all of this.
Right.
And he would not have said in Romans that we only need blood, because supposedly he did not really understand who God of the Tanakh was.
Awesome. Rabbi, you got it?
I sure do.
Okay, very good.
Thank you.
Thanks for calling in, and just tune in for your answer. Thanks. Bye.
The reason I don't believe that Paul was what he claims to be, a super Pharisee, a Pharisee of Pharisees, he makes this claim in a number of places where he, I believe, exaggerates his CV, where it matters in the opening chapter of Galatians, where he is saying that what I have, that means what I get, is directly from Jesus. What we would also find in Philippians 3, it is untenable that he was a Pharisee, although he certainly would have been exposed to Pharisee teachings. They were very well known because the Pharisees, that means let's use the words that are conventional. Just like today, people who are teaching at universities and they have access to what religious Jews are teaching. Paul certainly had access to that. The reason why I find that claim doubtful, if he in fact had a Pharisaic background, then it would be inconceivable that he would be working at the behest of the high priest who would be sending him to Damascus to go and persecute Christians. This would be like the chief rabbi would be working on behalf of Jews for Jesus. The Sadducees in the first century, this was a sect, a heresy of Judaism, where they denied the oral Torah, they denied life after death. These were what's called the Tzedukim. What's their history is not germane, and of course they disappeared after the destruction of the Second Temple. Why would he be persecuting Christians? In fact, if you look at our only source in the Christian Bible, that Paul was a student of Gamaliel, strangely, you will not find that in the letters of Paul. In the letters of Paul, those that are believed to be authentic or not, this claim is not made. And believe me, if Paul was ever a student of Gamaliel, we would have a lot of information about this. As Rabbi Gamaliel, he was one of the great giants of the generation. This is found only in the book of Acts. It's only in Acts this is written much later. It means the book of Acts, you could date to 85, 90 of the first century. By that time, no one could look it up. No one could send an email to the University of Gamaliel, please send me his graduation certificate. It would be late. Paul never makes such a claim. The reason why I doubt he was really from the Pharisaic worldview is because how he treats the resurrection of the dead. The fact that he misused the Jewish scriptures. You can have Jews who come from religious background and ultimately become apostates and adopt something else. But Paul's worldview was strictly Greek. For example, 1 Corinthians 15. That's a chapter that's very, very well known to Christians because it is in this chapter where Paul is talking about Jesus' crucifixion and the resurrection. And he insists that Jesus was crucified, he died, and he was 3 days in the tomb and resurrected from the dead. Now, in this chapter, Paul conveys a concept of the resurrection of the dead that was strictly Greek and not Jewish. A point must be made or you're going to miss this entirely. in the ancient world, in the Greco-Roman mindset, there was no concept of a physical resurrection of the dead because they thought it was ridiculous. The Greco-Roman world thought that Jews were insane for believing that you will actually resurrect back into the physical body that you had. This is a very important point. When Socrates drank the hemlock and committed suicide, he did so with great happiness and joy because he's finally done with this body. The Greco-Roman world saw the physical body as something that was very limited. It's not the higher state. The higher state is a spiritual state. And to return back into this mortal, corrupt body, that was inconceivable. In the Greco-Roman world, there was a life after death for sure, but the life after death was a spiritual body, not the physical tchias hamesim, that there are many who lie in earth, that literally that the bodies, that the dead will rise from their graves. See Daniel chapter 12, verse 2. See Isaiah chapter 26, verse 19. So this point, this posture, this is axiomatic. In the ancient world, the idea that there would be a physical resurrection, that the dead body would resurrect and come back, this was unknown. You could read Cicero's Republic, the 6th book. He talks about that. We're done with this. I don't want to go far and confuse you, but this was that idea that would be the underpinning of Gnosticism, the dualism. There's the spiritual and the physical, and they're not compatible. This is a totally limited addressing. You understand? So if you don't get this, there's a lot you won't get. Into the ancient world, besides the Jews, there was an idea of an afterlife, for sure. But in the Platonic view, this is done with. That's gone. The afterlife is a completely spiritual body. It's not a physical body. You understand? If you get only the Jews believe this, and the Greeks thought that we were nuts. The Greeks ridiculed the Jews for this. Although the Greeks, in many ways, the Greco-Roman world, had respect for the Jews because of our antiquity and because Alexander the Great was acquainted with the Jews, they weren't Jew haters in any crazy way, but they did hold, for a number of reasons, that Judaism was, what are you talking about? This was the big one. Why resurrect? Why would you want to go back to this? You would want to be in some spiritual body. Got it? This is a very important point. Nobody in the ancient world believed in the physical resurrection of the dead, and nobody wanted it. They thought it was very unappealing, and we have a lot of information about that. And now we can go to the worldview of Paul. In Paul's letter, in 1 Corinthians, is written, let's say, in the mid-50s. And this is an indisputed letter of Paul. There are 13 letters in the Christian Bible that are attributed to Paul. 7 of them are indisputed. This is one of those that are indisputed. Paul devotes this chapter to making sure you understand what that resurrection entailed. And it specifically entailed that Jesus was the physical body is like a seed that's planted in the ground, and that seed dies. What comes out is something totally different. And therefore, when Jesus died on the cross and he went into the tomb, what resurrected was something, he calls it a spiritual body. Now, both of those words are important. Body, but it's a spiritual body. It's not the natural body. That's completely Greek. Now, Tarsus, as it turns out, was one of the centers, really, in the ancient world at that time. It was one of essentially 2 or let's say 3 centers of Greek reflection, a Greek thought, a Greek philosophy. That was Paul's teachings was completely in sync with Greece. It was not in sync with traditional Judaism. Now, here we get to the rub. As it turns out, as the Christian religion is growing, meaning Paul's letters that are indisputed are all dated in the 50s, beginning with 1 Thessalonians, probably about 50, to Romans at the end of the 50s, right? 1 Thessalonians will be the earliest letter that is indisputed of Paul, Romans the end of it. Now, the Gospels come later. What we can do is we can make a prediction and then look at the text and see if it conforms. Watch this. I can make the prediction that if we examine the Gospels that are written from 70 to 95, Mark to John, I could predict that the church, the writers of the New Testament, will want to change what Paul was teaching and demonstrate that Jesus' resurrection was physical, like the Jews always believed, which means that the gospel writers are going to want to have a physical resurrection of Jesus, and he has a physical body. And the further we move into the first century, and the more elaborate, the more improved, that's a good word. It's italics, that word. It's in the quotation. The more improved the gospel is, means the later it is, the more physical the gospel writers want to make sure you understand was Jesus' resurrected body. So, in our earliest gospel, chronologically, not what appears first in a Christian New Testament, but the earliest gospel is Mark. Mark was written, let's say, about the year 70, the time of Churban Bayis Sheni, time of destruction of the Second Temple. So as it turns out, the book of Mark ends with chapter 16, verse 8, where the women come to the tomb and they meet presumably an angel that tells us that Jesus is not here, the tomb is empty, he is already risen, and he's gone before you to Galilee, and go back and tell the disciples. And the text in Mark ends in verse 8 would say that the women were afraid and they didn't say anything. They said nothing to anyone. That's how it ends. The last 12 verses of the book of Mark, from 16 verse 9 all the way to 16 verse 20, is a later interpolation. Virtually all Christian scholars, the most conservative scholars, agree, because our best and earliest manuscripts of Mark do not have those last 12 passages. This is uncontroversial unless you're in the most, fundamentalist King James, but just all the mainstream and evangelical, I don't mean mainline, I'm talking about this is a conceded point. So in Mark, there is a resurrection, but it's ambiguous. The book ends with the women say nothing to anyone. But where are the encounters? Where are all these fancy encounters we're going to find later? They're not to be found. Obviously, later Christian scribes found Mark's ending to be somewhat unsatisfying. And then they looked at the other Gospels and they wrote in an ending that are the last 12 pages that you'll find in your Christian Bible today, which somehow match to some degree with the other Gospels, with the Gospels of Matthew, Luke, and John. Incidentally, if you open up most Christian Bibles that have an annotation, in the commentary, it will tell you just what I said. Okay, this is not some conspiracy theory that I hatched up. Okay, now, what comes later? What comes later is we have, of course, the book of Matthew. In the book of Matthew already, the women encounter Jesus on the way back from the tomb. It's a total different story. They grab a hold of him and they worship him. So there's a very, very physical Jesus, a physical resurrection. We see the improvement. By the time we get to the book of Luke, which probably is, let's say, 5 years later than Matthew, it's a little bit later than Matthew, we find even more improvement. The author of the book of Luke, whoever it is, and don't let anyone tell you that he knows it was Luke, a companion of Paul. Nobody knows who wrote it. No one knows where it was written. But we know this. Whoever wrote it wanted to make sure that you knew that this was a physical body and not a spiritual body, as Paul says. And the author of the book of Luke writes in that Jesus met the disciples after the resurrection in a room in Yerushalayim. Luke does not want the disciples to run off to the Galilee. You won't find that in Luke Acts. Doesn't account because Luke has a completely different plot device. And there, Jesus is eating fish, burnt fish with the disciples. And what spirit can eat fish? Only a fully resurrected body. So what the church wants to do is obviously there's a pushback. Why? Traditional Judaism is a total physical resurrection. So now they're going, whoa. We went way into Athens. We went way into Tarsus. Way into Alexandria. We got to get this part back. We need the physical resurrection. And then, of course, we go to John. And John, we're introduced to a whole different news story where the doubting Thomas had to put his fingers in the very place where the nails were in the hands of Jesus. Well, why is that story in John and doubting Thomas doesn't exist in Mark, in Matthew? If there was a doubting Thomas, and that was a part of the history of the church going back to an early stage, do you really think that Paul would have ignored that and not mentioned that? Or Jesus says, oh, you saw and believe, blessed are those who believe without seeing it. That would have made it been all over the place. If I went further, incidentally, which I'm not going to do, beyond what is part of the Christian canon today. And I went to Gospels that were already written in the 2nd century that were considered to be canon, but ultimately the church fathers decided they shouldn't be. We will find other Gospels that are written which actually have the physical Jesus walking out of the tomb, literally with a walking, talking cross behind him, and Jesus is aided, has an angel on each side of him. If I went into later Gospels, meaning non-canonical Gospels, but were revered in the early stages of the church, you'd even take it further. What the church is seeking to do is to match Jesus' resurrection with what was Jewish, because that part they don't want to separate from Judaism, because they want to get it back. This was an authentically Jewish idea. So therefore, because historically Paul is working on behalf of a Sadducee, it's extremely unlikely that he was a Pharisee. That doesn't mean that he had no exposure to Pharisaic Judaism in the 1st century. Everybody did. Philo of Alexandria, he was born, let's say, in 11 BCE, very important historian, theologian, but he was a Hellenized Jew. He was not Orthodox. He was from North Africa, from Alexandria, and he visited Eretz Yisrael many, many times. He died somehow in the 50s. You know, of course, everybody was familiar with Orthodox Judaism, but the question is, was it part of your worldview? Just like today, everybody is familiar with Orthodox Judaism. I'm sure Richard Dawkins is familiar with Orthodox Judaism. Of course, professors who teach all kinds of in Harvard Divinity School teach all kinds of ideas that are completely antithetical to Judaism. They're all familiar with Jewish teaching, but they have been infected. Their ideas have been colored by other kinds of doctrines or other kinds of ideas that develop Wellhausen high criticism and so on and so forth. So everybody knew about Orthodox Judaism. I doubt if Paul was a student of Gamliel, you could be sure he would have revealed that in his letters. And that's the reason why Paul is very unlikely that he really grew up as a traditional Orthodox religious Jew. Now, the term Orthodox Jew, I want to be very clear, is a rather modern term. It's only a couple of centuries old, but it has a meaning to us in our day. I want to use conventional terms today. Then they would not be familiar with the word orthodoxa. Orthodox simply means the correct opinion. That's not a term anyone would have used in the 1st century. The term in the 1st century was Perushim. Today, that's not really used, so I want to use our language. This is the reason why Paul, I don't believe, really grew up in the world. That means that's where he was born. He was born into the world of the Pharisees, but he would make that claim. Why? Because that was the best credentials you can display. I was formerly Orthodox. I was, went to yeshiva all my life. And you had many of these Messianic rabbis who claimed to be formerly Orthodox. It turns out they were never Orthodox, but their grandmother ate gefilte fish, so suddenly everybody's formerly Orthodox. This is the kind of thing, I used to be Orthodox. There are many, many Messianic leaders out there. I'm not going to stop mentioning them because I don't want to make this personal. There are a lot of Messianic leaders out there who claim to be formerly Orthodox. And as it turns out, these people never were Orthodox. Their family their great-grandmother may have belonged to an Orthodox synagogue, and they had gefilte fish once, and suddenly everyone is formerly Orthodox. The reason they made that claim is, I was on the other side, I saw it, and now look where I am today, and I've accepted Yeshua in my life. So what Paul did, whether in pretense of the truth, the Gospels preach, Philippians 1:18, 1 Corinthians chapter 9:20, Christian missionaries are doing today. Paul presented himself as a Pharisee to give himself the highest credentials, and missionaries to this day are doing the same thing. But thank you for that question.
Adon olam asher malach b'terem kol יציר נברא לעת נעשה בחפצו כל אזי מלך שמו נקרא ואחרי ככלות הכל לבדו ימלוך נורא והוא היה